Jeremy. I'm not going to give a long introduction to Jeremy. Can those who are interfering with the audio please switch off, mute your video audio, please? People, please. There we are. So here we are. Jeremy speaking to us. I mean, if there's an SACP member who doesn't know who Jeremy is, they should resign forthwith. But in case there are people outside or very new members, Jenny, there's a lot of interruptions, eh? Can you mute all those people who are interfering? We're done. Okay, thanks, Jenny. So here we are. Jeremy's been a long-time activist of the SACP and ANC. He became part of the underground, and he then got imprisoned in 1976 with Sue Rapkins and Dave Rapkin. And he served a term in prison, and when he got released,
Comrade Yunus, you've muted. Can you unmute, please?
Yes, of course, I'm muted. All right, here we are. So Jeremy, if there's anybody in the party who doesn't know Jeremy, they should resign forthwith, Jenny. But in case there are others here who are very new members, I'll just say that Jeremy's he won't like it if I go through his whole CV, and I don't think there's a need for it. But basically, he's been an activist for many, many years, decades actually. He was in the underground structures here. He went out of the country. He came back after his studies, and he continued, was arrested in 1976 with Sue and Dave Rapkin, served a term in prison, got released, went out of the country, worked in the SACP and ANC, came back after 1990, became DGS immediately, I think, at our first conference. And then he also got elected onto the NEC, where he remained till the last conference in NASREC. He's decided to step down, and indeed he also stepped down as DGS of our party in July 2017. And then he's serving now currently in the PB and in the CC, and he was, of course, elected to Parliament in 1999. He became Deputy Minister of Transport. He was on the committee, Parliamentary Committee on Transport before that, Deputy Minister of Public Works. And of course, he's a prolific writer and thinker in our party. And as the editor, not for life, of Umsebenzi and AC, I can affirm that Jeremy is outstanding in delivering. You ask him to deliver on a Wednesday, you ask him on a Sunday night, it always appears the next day or the day well before that. So that's Jeremy. Welcome, Jeremy. Over to you. The other thing, Jeremy, we asked via Jenny that you consider, if possible, or Jenny can come in after you speak, linking your theme on corruption and recovery, economic recovery, also with the, which are interrelated, of course, also with the conference we had on Friday. And otherwise, Jenny can pick up on those themes as well, so that we link our political school, as you know more than us, with actual actions and campaigns. Thank you. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Yunus, Comrade Yunus. And thank you very much, Comrade Yunus, and good afternoon to all the comrades present in this Zoom meeting. When we decided on this particular theme, we knew it was going to be topical, but I think about 10 days ago, I don't think we just quite how topical it was going to be. Thank you, Yunus, for the suggestion that I should look at the resolutions, particularly coming from Friday's meeting convened by the party. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to look at that, and I missed that meeting. So I think it would be appropriate if Comrade Jenny came in and others who participated in that to make links, or even to disagree with things that I'm saying, which might be not in line with the party discussion, because these Jack Simons Party School inputs and lectures are meant to be engagements and discussion forums, and not the line, as it were, descending from one or another. So Comrade Jenny, I'm going to talk to a PowerPoint, and if Comrade Jenny could then project it onto the screen, we could then follow it. Just to say also that as Yunus has said, I've been in the struggle too long, and as a result, probably this is going to be a little bit long. But hopefully it would help to ground us in an understanding of the corruption challenges that we're facing. If we go to the next slide then. So right, I think that in a sense, I think we all have a sense that we're at a new potentially decisive phase, a kind of tipping point in the ANC alliance, in the movement in the country and in government. And obviously there's been this background of state capture, of the Zondo Commission and other commissions, a whole range of barrage of information and newspaper reports showing that there has been rampant corruption, both in the movement and in the state, and obviously in the private sector, in a tango between all of these forces. But simply what has now really prompted what as a decisive phase is the absolute outrage of brazen looting of election equipment, budget resources, and this has provoked real public outrage, including among a majority of ANC supporters, notwithstanding what Zuma's letter might be saying. COSATU has now called for a general strike on the 7th of October against corruption, and has gone so far as to say that they're holding Ramaphosa personally responsible and calling for him to wield a big axe. Ramaphosa has intervened with his letter to ANC members, saying basically, look, we might not be alone in the dock when it comes to being accused of corruption, but certainly in the court of public opinion, we are accused number one. And he's come up with a whole lot of proposals, particularly about internal ANC measures, lifestyle audits, and so forth. And then Zuma and others linked to the Gupta scandals have responded. He's responded in his letter, saying, amongst other things, your letter, Ramaphosa, is a public relations exercise by which you accuse the entire ANC in order to save your own skin. It's a major betrayal of those who voted for you. And he even plays the race card. You're being supported by white monopoly capital and your white friends in the media and so on. So basically, we're seeing from the Ramaphosa side a fairly shooting off, basically crossing a bit of a Rubicon, coming out much more firmly now inside of the ANC than we've seen in the past. And also Zuma and acolytes of Zuma responding also, trying to come up with their big guns blazing as well. So, what is the role of the SACP and progressive left forces in this context? And that's the big question that I want to pose. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, now the 2018 removal of Zuma and the very narrow 2018 ANC NASREC outcomes for the CR slate, basically, created a new unstable balance of forces. And really this history that I'm wanting to trace is about a series of unstable balance of forces within the ANC-led movement, and therefore, because of its impact on society and on government, unstable balance of forces both in government and our wider society. And when I wrote this, basically 3 or 4 days ago, I was saying that the ANC itself is still largely stalemated. Clearly, the signs were that the NEC, the National Working Committee, the top 6 were basically stalemating each other, blocking each other, which is why Zuma's letter was an attempt to address going a populist route, basically a demagogic route, trying to outflank Ramaphosa from within the ANC by pretending that what Ramaphosa had done had been to accuse all ANC members. Now, we don't know what's happening in the NEC. I mean, there are bits and pieces leaking out of it, but it could be that the beginnings of the stalemate are shifting somewhat inside of the ANC, NEC, National Working Committee and top 6. We don't know for sure. My own guess is that I think although there has been shifts in a positive direction, and there are some signs of that, I don't think that there's been a decisive breaking yet. And I think we can still expect the ANC through its provinces and regions down to branches, still to be considerably stalemated in its efforts to deal with corruption, amongst other things. In the state, however, in my view, there has been steady progress. And this confirms with what the party said in 2018 and 2019 after the elections, that although the ANC would be somewhat stalemated, the prospects for dealing with corruption, basically, and perversities that go with it, were better in the state. And that we, you know, yeah. So without going into this whole list, but here's a list of some of the things that have happened. Obviously, SARS, National Prosecuting Authority, Hawks, ESCOM, Transnet, with new boards, firing of people, etc., etc. There's been a significant, obviously still ongoing process of cleaning up in those places. ESCOM has recovered R1 billion from McKinsey, 150 million from Deloitte. It's cancelled $7 billion coal contract with the Guptas together, and so on and so forth. Transnet has compelled South China Rail to repay 680 million. Pension fund, Transnet pension funds have recovered 1.2 billion from Gupta entities. The new regulations for the Zonda Commission, which are very interesting, allowing the National Prosecuting Authority to use evidence, not in court, but to use evidence in order, you know, for their investigations that has emerged from the commission, as well as personnel who have been very active in the commission process, to use them in their assistance in investigation, and so on and so forth. I won't go on. But essentially, although most of this is about recovering assets, sequestrating some of the worst of the criminals, the Estina dairy people, and so forth. And there's not too many people in orange uniforms yet. I think the signs are that the net is closing. I mean, Zuma himself has suffered a series of setbacks around the arms deal corruption trial and so on. And I think that this is partly why there's become a typical, so apart from the COVID-19 PEP looting of PEP resources looting, which was just an outrage. I think the other reason why we're approaching a tipping point and why the Zuma network are trying to play, you know, play it all, you know, to exhaust their cards, is also that there's a strong sense now that the net is closing. If we could then move to the next slide. But how did we get here? Okay, so I want to go backwards a bit, and I hope that this, for me, I find it very useful to try and think all the way back to the 1990s, because I think that unless we do that properly and have a proper narrative about the past, not just the so-called 9 wasted years, but 20, 22, 20, whatever it is, years that maybe weren't entirely wasted, but have also where we've not done as much as we nearly could have or should have. So in 1995, as comrades will know, the SACP advanced the slogan, "Socialism is the future, build it now." And what it was intended to do was to mark a very clear break in any stagism from the side of the party. That's an accusation that is leveled against the party still today, that basically we're in alliance with the ANC because we think that the National Democratic Revolution is basically a bourgeois stage of the struggle, and that in a second stage, a separate second stage, we will build socialism. So that was what we were trying to do with advancing that slogan. We're trying to find our feet in the new reality, the post-1994 reality. So basically, we were saying that what was required, even for the National Democratic Revolution itself, for it to be really driven to its completion, it required a socialist morality, a socialist-oriented struggle. And we were advancing that not as free-riding hitchhikers, as the SACP, as entryists, as it were, taking a free ride inside of the ANC, but as I say, as a condition for an effective National Democratic Revolution itself. We weren't saying that you had to be socialist to be an honest, effective revolutionary within the context of the NDR. But we're saying that there was an important role for the Communist Party within the context of the NDR. In other words, put another way, we were saying that we needed to advance working class and popular hegemony within this phase of the struggle of the NDR. Not a dictatorship of the proletariat or a dictatorship of the Communist Party, not unilateralism. Obviously, we needed to work with a multi-class reality and so on over the NDR. But unless we inflected it with increasing working class hegemony, popular hegemony, that the NDR itself would go wrong. And it had been made possible, but it was still very challenging by the critical 1994, 1996, democratic and constitutional rupture with white minority rule. Can we go to the next slide? Now, of course, this was challenged, okay. This idea of building elements of capacity for momentum towards socialism in the course of the National Democratic Revolution was challenged, and very deliberately so from some quarters, by a different class hegemonic project, which obviously inserted itself within the ANC, but also obviously was strongly influenced from outside of the ANC. And we called it in the party, and I'm not sure if this still remains the right word, but let's stick with it, the 1996 class project, which was essentially a massive retreat from the ANC of the Morogoro strategy and tactics, a massive retreat for that matter from the ANC of the 1955 Freedom Charter. And it was essentially a stagist approach, a vulgarization of the National Democratic Revolution. We joked of it that they were saying, yes, no, we don't disagree with socialism, etc., but socialism might be the future. You can build it then in some very distant future. So essentially what this was, this what we called 1996 class project, was to reconfigure the notion of the National Democratic Revolution as really just a stage of normalizing capitalism, of modernizing it maybe a little bit, and critically of deracializing and perhaps a bit later engendering it as well. So it was not about the thoroughgoing transformation of a racialized, engendered capitalism, but to create better representativity, class and gender, well, not class, but better racial and gendered representativity essentially within the capitalist system. And of course, there was lots of support for this perspective from outside of the ANC. I mean, here's just one of lots of examples. This is the Center for the Development Enterprise and Bernstein's outfit. In 1999, they produced a document called Policy Making in a New Democracy, which was, of course, sponsored by, in this case, SA Breweries. And what they argued is what the country needs is a new center of gravity, not the COSATU, SACP, left-leaning ANC of the Freedom Charter. The ANC itself needs to become an instrument for marketing and selling the new approach. They were referring directly to gear. And they even said, we're not suggesting that modern revolutionaries in the global village should all have MBAs, but this is a useful analogy. So essentially what they're saying is they're wanting cadre deployment as well, but the cadres need to be basically MBA types. So you can see the kind of class project that was supported from outside of the ANC, but also developed from inside. Next slide. Okay, so this was what we might call a revisionist hegemonic project with the support of monopoly capital, imperialist capital, and it attempted to build itself on several pillars. And it was quite successful in basically being the hegemonic reality within the movement and certainly within government, but not unchallenged. So the pillars on which it tried to build itself were one, locking South Africa, the new democratic South Africa, into neoliberal macroeconomic policies with a kind of trickle-down redistribution. It was about transforming the state apparatus, right-sizing, privatizing, corporatizing public utilities, which were now shaped as SOEs, as enterprises, what we've referred to as the tenderised state. It was a broad movement anchored in social struggles, as in the 80s, into an electoral formation primarily with a narrow presidential, what we called at the time Bonapartist managerial center. And then critically about cultivating a new class force within the ANC, what was described as a patriotic black bourgeoisie, to obviously, amongst other things, counterbalance the weight of the organized working class and of the left inside of the ANC and inside of the broader movement. And then also to develop a new ethos, which was most famously announced by Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who said at the time when he was Minerals and Energy Minister, blacks should not be ashamed to be filthy rich, when she unveiled in 2002 the new mining charter. I suspect that she regrets having said that now, but she did. And let's not forget that she was being shaped up to be, if Polokwane hadn't happened, to be, so that while Mbeki would have remained ANC president, the new president of the ANC would have been Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. Of course, Smatsu Ngonyama, everyone remembers that I didn't struggle to be poor. So we see the 1996 class project was about encouraging a different and unlocking new class forces. Let's go to the new, next slide. Okay, so this obviously then also involved a very aggressive offensive against the SACP and our notion of building socialism now, and also a massive offensive against the working class and COSATU. So Mbeki and his circle portrayed the SACP's strategic position as ultra-leftist, and even with dog whistles as insurrectionist, as treasonable against a democratically elected government. There was the famous 2 strategies of the National Liberation Movement, written ostensibly, probably considerably by Mbeki himself, by Jabu Moleketi and Josiah Jele, accusing us basically of insurrectionism against the democratic elected state. Dumasani Mackay alleged that the SACP leadership regarded April 1994 as our Bolshevik, as the February 1917, and the party was now bent on making its own October 1917 in order to crush the Kerenskis, the Mackays and Mbekis and so on in the ANC. And when there was, in 2001 and 2002, when elements in government sought to portray those mass worker stayaways, which were led by COSATU, but supported by the party against privatization policies, they tried to present them as an uprising against the state. Next slide. Right. Now, as I say, they achieved this 1996 class project achieved a fair degree of hegemony, or of dominance, let's say, rather, within the state and within the party, the ANC. But it was an unstable hegemony for numbers of reasons. First of all, it couldn't win its key positions democratically within the alliance. I mean, this began, for instance, in late 1993 with what was then the Transitional Executive Council that was put in place in the midst of the negotiations, and which had ANC persons as well as National Party persons serving on it. And there was a secret negotiation with the IMF for a loan of $850 million US. And a secret letter was written by the TEC involving ANC comrades, including Tito Mboweni, a letter of intent promising wage restraint, inflation targeting, trade and industrial liberalization, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm mentioning this because we've had an exact replay of this this year with another letter, this time not secret, to the IMF, promising much more than the IMF requires in this case and in that case. But essentially the agenda was to lock us in, and using the authority of the IMF and these letters of promise and a loan to lock us into neoliberal austerity, basically, programs. Okay, so I remember in 1994, so as a party, we were not familiar with this. It was kept from us. We didn't have a sense of this happening. And I remember in the NEC, I raised, I think it was Patrick Bond, who mentioned to me, do you know about the IMF loan? And I said, no, I didn't know anything about it. And so I raised it in an NEC in 1994. And I said, could the leadership please explain this IMF loan and the secret letter and so forth? And I remember Madiba and the top table looking very puzzled. Okay, Madiba certainly didn't know what this was about. And eventually Tito Mboweni, who was on the NEC right from the back, he liked to sit in the back of the NEC meetings, stood up and he said, no, he said, yes, no, we've taken out a little loan, but we did it with the National Party in 1993, nothing to worry about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how things continue, hey? Anyway, obviously, the point I'm trying to make is that they couldn't win their positions democratically, this 1996 class project. And GEAR is the most obvious example. It was delivered and was proclaimed as non-negotiable, as written in stone and so forth. But it was not the only policy that was brought in through stealth. And we see basically this was a great weakness of Mbeki, who had lots of strengths, by the way, and lots of skills. But he also mishandled terribly the Zuma corruption charges. So he never brought to the NEC, for instance, on which I was serving at that stage, the challenge that the corruption charges that Zuma was now facing that what obviously we couldn't or shouldn't politically interfere in that process, but what were the political implications for the ANC and its broader movement that the then deputy president was facing corruption charges. So he basically said, look, we can't discuss it. It's with the courts when he was in a political forum. But we now know also that when it came to the criminal justice system, there was active politicizing of the process directed against Zuma, which allowed, using Leonard McCarthy, Bulelani Luka and others, which allowed Zuma to basically escape from the process and to not inaccurately describe what was going on as a politicization of the criminal justice system. The other reasons for the weakening hegemony or dominance of the 1996 class project at this stage is that their trickle-down policies just weren't going to work and couldn't work. So there was growth as a result, not necessarily of gear, but following gear, but it was largely jobless growth. And so through these years, there was growing mass dissatisfaction as unemployment grew, inequality wasn't transformed, and so on. And poverty was somewhat improved, but not dramatically. And then critically also, absolutely, was, if you start to promote through BE promotions, some of your inner circle, you quickly realize that not every Black person can become filthy rich. And so increasingly we saw factions of business interests, of aspirant BEs, fighting out amongst themselves, sense of resentment against the inner Mbeki circle who seemed to be getting the BE deals and others not getting them. And in particular, we saw the emergence of provincial fiefdoms, now increasingly based not so much on BE promotions and share deals and so on, but just on provincial parasitism in Limpopo, notably in Mpumalanga, but in other places as well. So all of these things further destabilized the 1996 class project and obviously came to a head at the Polokwane conference. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to park the history for a moment. I'll come back to Polokwane and the Zuma victory and so forth. But to try to bed down what are the vectors for corruption and the corruption pandemic that we've got now, which in my view were laid down in the mid-1990s. Okay. Now, currently, most of the anti-corruption discussion focuses on strengthening the criminal justice system and more generally on having a much more capable, transparent and honest state functioning. And then also a lot of the discussion focuses on moral issues. We need an ethical leadership. We need to promote values of public service, of Botopelli and so on. And these are absolutely correct emphases, absolutely right. And the SACP must support them, absolutely. But the argument that I want to develop is that on their own, they will not address the systemic underlying features that have contributed to the runaway plague of corruption that we've got. And so I want to talk to three interrelated issues. The first is to this notion of the attempted promotion of a Black patriotic capitalist class. The second issue is the tenderized state. And the third is the challenges of party political fundraising on a multi-party democracy terrain, but a terrain dominated by capitalism in a capitalist society. And all of this trying on the terrain of a society with massive unemployment, poverty, and inequality. So I'll try and deal with those three now next. Okay, so the first vector is this 1996 class project attempt to promote what they thought would be a standalone, kind of separate Black capitalist class, which would be patriotic. So in 1997, and then running into the 1998 Alliance Summit, the Mbeki grouping developed a strategic paper, which I think is still available on the ANC website. It was published in Umkhabulo in 1998. It's called The State, Property Relations and Social Transformation. And in there, we get the first coherent, strongly developed argument for the promotion of a black capitalist class as an important strategic objective, not as just something by the way, but as a critical pillar and strategic objective of the National Democratic Revolution. And here are a couple of key quotes from that paper. It said that in a systematic way, the National Democratic Revolution has to ensure that ownership of private capital at all levels is not defined in racial terms. Of course, what they go on to do is then define capital ownership in racial terms. But anyhow, thus the new state, the document went on, in its procurement policies, in its programs of restructuring state assets, a light word for corporatization and privatization of public utilities, and its utilization of instruments of empowerment, pressure, and other measures promotes the emergence of a black capitalist class. Okay, look at that quote and note how this version of the state is a state that is a procurer, a privatizer, a corporatizer, a regulator, but not a productive doer, not something that does things, okay? And I'll come to that. That's obviously the second vector I want to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in these engagements in 1998, the party came out really strongly, saying, okay, is a standalone patriotic black bourgeoisie possible, let alone desirable in the South African community? And we raised two related points. First of all, with South Africa's relatively developed capitalist economy and long-established South African capitalist class, which of course was and still is overwhelmingly white and male, but you know, the capitalist revolution had long happened in South Africa in a particular distorted way, but it had happened, which also meant that the majority of South Africans were proletarianized as well. So not only was there a South African capitalist class in its own right, white and male, sure, but there was also a South African proletariat in its own right and a very small middle strata, hardly much of a peasantry and so forth. So there wasn't the possibility of a separate South African black capitalist class to emerge. But even if it were possible and related to the above point, we said, you know, if there was such a hypothetical class, could it play a patriotic role in the sense that it could drive modernization, technological development, and broad economic development? Now, and it's worth reading whatever you can find from Saki Maktozoma, who is one of the, I think, most interesting and honest of the beneficiaries of BEE and one of the early beneficiaries of BEE. And in his view, there was no other practical and effective instrument for South Africa to de-racialize, as he put it, the economy within a reasonable time. So BEE had to be it. So you can see that here again is this revisionism of what we mean by the NDR. Elite redistribution of shares, essentially, on loan from monopoly capital to a new politically collected elite, equals the deracialization of the capitalist economy. It might begin to deracialize the boardroom, but is it deracializing the economy? And this is equated to the NDR. Let's move along. And we further argued, and I think this remains very important to continue for this understanding to come across, is that there were structural reasons for the impossibility of a vanguard national democratic, of a black capitalist class to constitute a vanguard of the national democratic revolution. So for instance, we said in the mid-1990s, South Africa was not South Korea in the early 1960s. So South Africa, you know, it's easy to forget that in the early 1960s, South Korea was an incredibly backward country. Its GDP, I think more in the sort of late 50s, was less than Ghana at the time, okay? But then under the military dictatorship of the early 1960s of General Park, and with huge Cold War support of US imperialism, so let's remember that South Korea was right on the doorstep of North Korea and therefore in the front line of the Cold War. Under this authoritarian military rule, they were able to launch what has turned out to be a remarkable industrialization process. At first export-led, led by authoritarian rule, and allowing, with a considerable vanguard role, if you like, of an emerging national bourgeoisie, the Samsungs and so forth, the big chaebols of South Korea. nor, if we turn to China, another example of a country emerging from development of huge backwardness, nor was South Africa in the mid-1990s, China of the late 1970s, which didn't have a capitalist class in the 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping, out of the disaster, basically, of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural War and so on, cautiously began to liberalize, but under very firm control of the Chinese Communist Party and a very strong state, allowed the emergence of a modernizing, technologically developing Chinese capitalist class, and therefore a capitalist class capable of playing unevenly but a patriotic role in the development of China. Jack Ma would epitomize that. And nor, we said, could, because many ANC communists were saying, Afrikaners did it. Look at volkscapitalism. Look at how they used the National Party victory in 1948 to empower Afrikaans economic empowerment. Why can't we do that? Well, I'm not saying there aren't some things we can't learn from the Afrikaner nationalist movement. I mean, they took very seriously artisanal development, or using big state-owned enterprises like railways and harbors, which then became Transnet later on, to drive development, white development, artisanal development for whites, and so forth. We've thrown lots of those things away. But essentially, Afrikaner volkscapitalism emerged from a primitive accumulation process based on the hyper-exploitation of influx-controlled black farm labor. We spoke last week about, we were commemorating Ruth First, and she wrote about the terrible potato farms and convict labor, basically, out of which this primitive accumulation for Afrikaner capitalism occurred. Let's move to the next slide. So primitive accumulation, or primary accumulation, is exactly the point. That, you don't get to be a capitalist, or for capitalism to develop requires some form of accumulation, of primitive accumulation, to enter into the process of expanded capitalist accumulation. Okay. If you're the Oppenheimers, then you inherit the primitive accumulation that occurred, back in the 19th century and early 20th century. But if you're, by and large, if you're an aspirant black capitalist in South Africa, then you've got to have some kind of primitive or primary accumulation in you. There's no intergenerational, very little intergenerational passing on of primitive accumulation. And so we argued as the SACP that new fractions of the capitalist class could only substantively emerge through two forms of primitive accumulation. That's not to say that there wouldn't be some individuals who are black who could emerge as fully fledged capitalists through other routes, but essentially it would take the form either of indebted shareholding from existing monopoly capital. And this was the BE route, essentially, with all of the dangers locked into their agenda, their neoliberal agenda, or just looting of public resources, parasitism, state capture, and so on. Now, very interestingly, in the debates of 1997, 1998, the Mbeki grouping actually conceded that these were dangers. And again, I quote from that document of theirs from 1998. They said, while these forces, an emergent black capitalist class, are direct beneficiaries of the NDR, they can easily be co-opted into the agendas of their white counterparts, and they can also easily become a source of corruption within the state. So they said this in 1998. And this was a prophetic concession from the Mbeki paper. But they simply then conclude the ANC leadership of these forces is therefore critical. And of course, the terrible question we need to ask now as we look at our ANC is who is leading who? Is an ANC committed to a radical economic transformation in the real and proper sense of that word, leading and guiding an emerged black capitalist strata, or are those strata leading the ANC? And that's whether at a national level, provincial level, branch or regional level of the ANC, but for that matter, COSATU, and the party's not immune to these challenges as well. And I'm not saying the one or the other, but I'm saying that the illusion that the ANC was going to be able to lead these animal forces and appetites that were unleashed unfortunately, has proved to be a serious error. Let's move along. Okay, I mean, these are just quick, we can go quickly over these, but basically, as a result of these kinds of agendas, what we've seen is the inequality amongst South African Africans has been the fastest growing inequality. And intra-Black Gini inequality is the fastest growing in South Africa. In 2015, just to take one snapshot from here, there were 21,000 white dollar millionaires with assets of more than 14.5 million. But already by then there were 17,300 black dollar millionaires. So then, and the number had nearly trebled in the 8 years between 2007 and 2015. Obviously, that's still not, I mean, if you're into wanting there to be racial parity or racial representativity when it comes to dollar millionaires, then you would still note that the black dollar millionaires are only 45%, while white are 55%. But really, is that changing South Africa? Moving along. Move along, yeah. That's just showing a similar thing, that the Gini inequality amongst Africans at 0.56 is close to the overall world record asset wealth inequality Gini of South Africa, which is 0.59. Okay, let's move along then. Okay, now having raised serious concerns about BEE and the attempt to promote actively as a key pillar of the National Democratic Revolution, of course, it's important to introduce qualifications. First of all, you know, and maybe this is the point I need to make throughout the paper, that, you know, we use words or categories or concepts like the 1996 class project and so forth. And we must be careful of imagining that people are, you know, captives of a particular tendency for all time, that it's an unchanging tendency and so on. But in order to make sense of history and reality, both our contemporary and past reality, we do need to use concepts, but sometimes they, yeah. Okay, so first of all, we're not saying that black capitalists individually or collectively are necessarily bad people, any more for that matter than white capitalists. They might be nicer, I don't know, black capitalists than white capitalists, but the main point as Marxists that we want to make is that there are systemic limitations to what capitalists who want to be patriotic or developmental or pro-ANC or whatever confront. And in a way, this is what Sakinakto Zuma, again, who I say the most honest of, in my view, of the BE beneficiaries, had to say. He said, back in the early 2000s, when some from within the ANC said, you're not doing enough for your black brothers and sisters now that you've arrived, you're kicking away the ladder. And he said, but how do you expect me to behave any differently from other capitalists? If I did, I would soon be out of business. And that's a profound point that he's making. Yeah. So the other point that one qualification that one wants to make is that obviously the SACP supports the Freedom Charter call to remove all racial and gendered restrictions, as the Freedom Charter does explicitly, on the rights to trade. I mean, it's ludicrous in a democracy that certain rights to trade, certain rights to occupy certain areas and so on, you know, are forbidden and so on. And we've clearly removed those, and the party obviously agrees with that. But also, we're not, the SACP is not the DA. We are not racist denialists. I mean, which is precisely why from the 1920s we supported a national democratic revolution. And therefore we support a wide range of targeted, affirmative and other measures that take into account the system of racialization, of gender and of class in our society. Employment equity is a really important instrument. You know, it could be improved, perhaps it's how it's monitored and so on. Land reform that addresses the huge racial, gendered, and of class inequities in the land reality is absolutely critical. NSFAS, which is a class-sensitive bursary, basically, for students, is absolutely right. I think we should support the Black Industrialist Program because it's not about supporting black simply in the hope that they will become patriotic, but it's about supporting black entrepreneurs who've got a track record of productive activity, of job creation, of capacity to introduce greater competition into the market and so forth. And obviously the state support for co-ops, SMMEs, the township economy, recognition for prior learning is a really critical thing. You know, thousands and thousands of very skilled artisans basically could never acquire artisans tickets in South Africa for racial reasons. And yet, they are better artisans often than those that have come through the process. So all of those things and many, many others. So we don't want to be misunderstood as being against a range of measures designed to overcome the racial inequities of the past. And insofar as we are in a capitalist society, the SACP supports state intervention to incentivize, but more often probably to compel, patriotic behavior by capitalists, not just black ones, but white ones. And that means that we need to use state power as much as possible to ensure that money is not, surplus earned in our economy, produced in our economy, is not frittered away in Zuma financialization, and that goes to serious reindustrialization, that goes to job creation, that is fixed investment. We need to really keep the pressure on and prescribed assets, what is now euphemistically called impact investments. We need localization, we need beneficiation, all the things that we fought for very actively. We need to curb huge capital flight, base erosion of companies, white and black, using offshore tax havens and illegal transfer pricing. So, we're not saying that the bourgeoisie can't be part of a national democratic effort, but it needs to incentivize, but above all, compelled to do so. Okay, second key vector for the corruption pandemic, and that is what we call the tenderised state. Now, integral to the kind of neoliberal turn that took place in our movement in the mid-1990s was the embrace of what was called new public management, which was about repurposing of the state. The argument would be that in a kind of neoliberal repurposing of the state, that the state, we were told, should steer, not row. Don't bother to go to the effort of rowing. Leave that to the markets, to the private sector and so on. The state should be a regulator, a procurer through tenders, and it should create a market-friendly conditions, but it shouldn't be a doer. What we've discovered, of course, is unless you have some oars in the water yourself, your ability to regulate and to honestly procure and so forth, and to set agendas is very limited, and you get outgunned. Part of this tenderization was to present the public sector, basically, and public sector workers as a financial drain. I remember Trevor Manuel saying, it's not the job of the state to create jobs. Government is not an employment agency, we were told. And so, following this credo, we closed down critical areas of the public sector, like nursing and training colleges, and so on. So linked to that was about right-sizing and therefore often downsizing of the public sector. And a lot of that in the name of often dispatching white professionals, so we transforming the public sector. A lot of those professionals, white and black, took early retirement packages under pressures, and then have now returned as private consultants, private contractors, and so on, doing the work they were doing, but at 3 times the price. It was also about privatizing as much as possible, and failing that, at least corporatizing public entities, which this happened slightly before us, but the public utilities like the South African railways and harbors, like Eskom, like Sasol, were turned into enterprises, state-owned enterprises. They were expected to return a profit to the shareholder government. A couple of weeks ago, I had an interesting discussion around a task I was doing with Bobby Gottsall. And so this is Bobby Gottsall, from Anglo American, who said to me, when he was made the chairperson of the board of Eskom, this is before the Guptarization of Eskom, he was shocked to find that I forget what it's called, but the agreement between Eskom and the shareholder, i.e. the government, should return a dividend of 7.5% annually to the state. And this was a secret agreement, okay, which we didn't know about. So it took a patriotic, if you like, capitalist like Bobby Gotzel to recognize the bizarre nature of this corporatization of Eskom. And then massively what has also happened is the outsourcing of former state capacity. I mentioned that in the previous bullet point. I don't know if any of you have been to Esalen Park. We used to have NEC meetings there in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It's a huge campus, which was a South African Railways and Harbours, later Transnet campus. It's massive. It's bigger. It's as big as, I think, as Pretoria University, basically, with wonderful resources and so forth. And South Africa was turning out world-class railway engineers, electrical engineers, and so on from that campus. We've still got patents, railway patents, and things like that, which are still valid around couplings for carriages and so on, which emerged out of that. And there was also artisanal training going on as well there. Okay, so we outsourced even public policy development. I won't go into the horrible story about the Department of Transport's NatMap, but even, you know, the annual ritual of municipal IDPs, they're basically done by, in most cases, they're supposed to be involving public participation, but in most cases they involve outsourced consultants who come in, do a cut and paste job, go away, they don't leave any capacity behind in the municipality, and then they come back, or another lot come back the next year and do the same thing. And then critically also, another massive problem, and here Treasury is, you know, must account for this. We abolished the state tender board in 2000 and decentralized financial accountability. So this has now become this major vector, this tenderized state, where we're tendering for everything and doing very little, including even policy as the state. We're tendering it outside. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, just again, a qualification. I've heard some comrades saying we must abolish the tender system. Now, I think I know what they mean, is that it's, you know, it's just the way in which everything gets tendered and outsourced from government is a huge problem. But even if we have a significantly effective developmental state, it will still need to tender, hopefully on a much, much, much less scale. But it must be done in a transparent and, you know, process and so on. And I think one welcomes some of the discussion around this. Because some of the worst corruption has happened where there hasn't been a tender at all. So it's not about abolishing the tender system like the EFF says for their own reasons, but massively limiting it and building a state that has capacity, including productive capacity. And the state must become increasingly a price maker, not a price taker. I mean, the state acquires huge amounts of things. Comrades will remember when I last was still in a deputy minister in public works, we discovered that we were paying for glasses, for renting glasses for conferences, 20 Rand a glass. That's just a glass for water. We're paying 20 Rand instead of buying the glasses and having them in stock, or charging 2 cents or something if we're hiring them. The state, procures huge amounts of stuff. And very usefully, and again, Public Works really welcomed this, Treasury introduced a central procurement office that would centralize and set clear guidelines for what the state should be paying for files, for staplers, and so on. And I'm not sure what's happened to the central procurement office. I gather it's kind of lost its legs and so on. We really do need to ensure that we strengthen that central and build a strong central procurement office. And those are the things that we mean by a more capable state. Let's move to the next slide. Okay. The third systemic vector for corruption, for the corruption pandemic, is political party funding. Okay, now there's a global crisis for so-called liberal democracy. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the US, and not just recently, but over a long period, or the UK, then you will see that there's a huge problem with attempting to promote a progressive politics or relatively progressive politics on the terrain of multi-party liberal democracy in a society that's dominated by capitalism. So it's quite interesting. I mean, both Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Sanders more recently have both ran very credible and quite interesting progressive left platforms, one within the Labour Party and the other in the Democratic Party. But Sanders and they were able to use imaginative ways of funding and resourcing themselves, crowdfunding, thousands and hundreds of thousands of students and you know, sort of professionals and so on, funded them through individual corporate contributions rather than relying on corporate funding. But at the end of the day, they were outfinanced, particularly Sanders. You know, first time round by Hillary Clinton and the massive corporate money that flowed in, and now again by Joe Biden, ruining what was, you know, an interesting and they proclaimed themselves as democratic socialists, the Sanders platform. But I mean, those were in wealthy societies where they were quite strong and relatively wealthy professionals, middle classes, and even, you know, students were able to make contributions. In South Africa, obviously, it's a different situation. Now, ever since the unbanning of the ANC, the whole party funding issue has been a huge problematic challenge and a danger, you know, dangerous terrain. I remember Comrade Madiba, who was our first ANC fundraiser in the early 1990s. And he was a very effective fundraiser, but with all kinds of problems, okay. So, you know, at one point, he was strongly pushing a two-China policy that basically we should recognize Taiwan. You know, so that wasn't UN policy, but he'd gone to Taiwan, and Taiwan, of course, for its own opportunistic reasons, had given the ANC a significant donation, and Madiba didn't pocket it. I'm sure he passed it on to the ANC. And because he was honorable about it, but was naive about the realities. Can you imagine? Because if we'd gone for a two-China policy, we would have been derecognized by the People's Republic of China. And where would we be now as South Africa with a rising hegemon with its own challenges of a China? Okay. But of course, this fundraising for the ANC, which didn't have money, which didn't have resources, got murkier and murkier with Chancellor House, with the arms deal, with the Eskom build and Hitachi and so forth, okay. And increasingly the line between party fundraising, personal enrichment, so you fund nominally for the ANC or COSATU or the party maybe, and you pocket some of the money and pass maybe some of it on to the ANC. You know, those of you who listen to what Nomvula Mokonyane was saying and at the Zondo Commission a couple of weeks back, she was saying, yes, no, I was working with Bosasa, but, you know, I was the provincial treasurer at the time, and Bosasa was very generously contributing to the ANC's electoral platform. They even gave their offices for our national campaign, election campaign, and so forth. So there was nothing abnormal about it. There were no birthday parties and so on, which we know differently now. So you're getting this personal enrichment justified by those other things. Get filthy rich. You know, it's part of a patriotic duty to build a BE and so forth, a BE capitalist class. So you get the blurring. And then it became even more blurring when increasingly the fundraising became fundraising for competing party factions or platforms. And of course, as we know, and this is the entry point that the Zumaites have tried to use now and have been for a while, along with the EFF, the CR17 platform was reported to have been funded to the tune of some 500 million rand ahead of the NASREC conference. Now, personally, I'm glad that platform's won narrowly at NASREC. And I've no doubt that the alternative platform was also hugely funded, probably by even more dubious money. But let's admit it, it's a problem. It's a problem that this is happening. And how could the SACP, if we contemplated fighting elections, compete with that kind of money that's getting thrown around? And it's not just in the ANC. I mean, Mmusi Maimane was reported to have been funded by 100 million rand in his campaign against Wilmot James for the leadership of the DA. And the EFF's attacks on SARS was obviously directly related getting from the cigarette smuggler Adriano Mazzotti. And I wonder, and I have no proof, so perhaps I shouldn't say it, so maybe this is a query. You know, it's interesting how the EFF has come around with a very heavy don't open up the economy support, certainly for lockdown 5 and 4, and one wonders whether that has something to do with the fact that cigarettes no longer, but cigarette sales were banned, and there was a lot of money to be made out of cigarette smuggling. I don't know if that's true, but I have my suspicions. But it's interesting how the EFF's line on opening up the economy was exactly the opposite of the DA's. So I understand from very reliable sources that the DA has suffered very significant financial losses, funding losses, had to retrench large numbers of DA support staff and so on. And this is because following the Ramaphosa's election as president of the country, the sort of corporate money has shifted in that direction and away from the DA. So the DA desperately tried to use the corporate profits of the lockdown to go the kind of Trump route of open up the economy, and this lockdown is ridiculous and so on. Let's move on. I won't go on to Jordan Lewis, but if someone wants to ask me about Jordan Lewis, we can talk about him. Okay, so these 3 vectors, okay, systemic vectors, on top of the ongoing socioeconomic triple crisis, in other words, the use of the ANC to promote a narrow BE elite, the tenderization of the state, and party political funding, and all of the problems in that area in a capitalist society are interacting with this unsustainable crisis of inequality, poverty, unemployment, and all the other things that are linked to it, gender-based violence and so on. And all of these things are now getting worse and will get much worse as a result of the impact of COVID-19. And so we need to understand why, obviously, poverty or unemployment or inequality on their own don't or shouldn't create a crisis, a pandemic of corruption. But the interaction between the 3 vectors and the conditions in which the majority of South Africans are living promote a political terrain which is quite easily polluted, where political office or being associated with someone in a political office and so on can be the one chance of escaping a lifetime, literally, of unemployment and of grinding poverty. And it's why we have this churn also in politics, particularly at the municipal level, council level. You know, people are expected to be around in councils for 5 years, but then they must make way. They've had their chance to eat. They must make their way for the next generation, for the next lot, for the next network, and so on. So, you know, and these are realities. It's the slippery pole of climbing up into political office through all kinds of means, hit squads and all kinds of things. We need to understand why this is happening. Right, let's move along. Okay, so now I want to go back again to pick up, having talked about those things. Now, where we are now, okay, sorry, where we are following the Polokwane conference was a next period of unstable hegemony, unstable domination of a grouping inside of the ANC. So I agree with Zuma somewhat, but for completely different reasons, when in his letter he says he objects to this notion of 9 wasted years. My objection is not that the 9 years were not considerably wasted and thrown away through looting of public resources. But the cutoff of 9 wasted years obscures the active complicity of the earlier problems of the 1996 class project and established monopoly capital in the 3 major vectors for corruption, in the early politicizing of the criminal justice system. Jackie Salebe, was the police commissioner, and they didn't deal with him for years and years and years, with the whole Agliotic scandal and so on. With the first wave of massive corruption and state capture, the arms deal and so on, and with the ongoing triple socioeconomic crisis, which of course is not to deny that there was an exponential explosion of corruption in the Zuma years, and particularly in his second term, the 2014 to 2018, the truncated second term of Zuma. Now, again, just to go over terrain that we're familiar with, but it's important, I believe, to do this. So the 2007 Polokwane ANC Conference outcome was a relatively narrow victory for the JZ platform, a 60%, 40%, roughly speaking, victory. And it was based on an unstable marriage of convenience between a left axis, basically the SACP and COSATU, and other progressive comrades inside of the ANC, on the one hand, and a parasitic primitive accumulation tendency platform, which was especially anchored around provincial networks, where, as I said earlier, the more parasitic forms of primitive accumulation had already taken root in places like Limpopo and so on. But the 60% victory obviously still left a not unsubstantial 40% 1996 class project, still relatively present and strong within the ANC. Let's move along. So in his first term, and obviously these are fairly, things are less cut and dry than I'm presenting them, but for the purposes of presentation, in Zuma's first presidential term, 2009 and 2014, what he sought to do was, as best as possible, to hold together, one, the marriage of convenience axis, the left axis and the parasitic accumulators, but also as much of the 1996 class tendency that stayed on, sulkily within the movement. And so the left got very important key ministerial posts. DTI, I think Comrade Rob I don't want to embarrass him, but Comrade Rob, became minister and remained minister in trade and industry, and used that to really wage as best as possible, having us fallen back terribly in terms of trade liberalization and all kinds of other bad mistakes, to, as best as possible, roll back trade liberalization, to introduce industrial policy, the IPAPs and so forth. The COSATU aligned left comrade Ibrahim Patel got economic development. Those were perhaps the 2 key ministerial posts, but party comrades, Comrade Blade and others, Tulis also got important ministerial positions in that, indicating Zuma's attempt to balance the left axis and so on. But at the same time, the 1996 class project, space was created for them, and particularly in this first term, Treasury was left largely intact and on its same neoliberal mission, basically. And of course, the Planning Commission was given to Trevor Manuel. While on the other hand, the looters, the Malemas, still in the ANC at this stage, the Youth League, the provincial looters and so on, were given a great deal of latitude. So in this period, Zuma's main focus was to stay out of jail. And so the main focus in this first term was a massive assault on the criminal justice system, on the revenue system, on SARS, on the intelligence apparatus. They were unable, interestingly, largely to subvert the judiciary, which remained pretty intact. Okay, next slide. But his second presidential term took on a new character. It's not that it didn't start in the previous term, but it really, took on a huge pace in the second term. So having corroded the NPA, SARS, Hawks, intelligence, the SAPS leadership, the SABC, the PIC, and so on. State capture plunder now really took off in a big way, with a major focus, not only, but on the key SOEs, ESCOMs, Transnets, and so on, Denel, and so forth. But even in this period, they failed to capture Treasury, although they tried over a weekend to do that. They couldn't pervert and tried to take over the Reserve Bank, the Financial Intelligence Center, the DTI, the Department of Economic Development, the DBSA, IDT, the judiciary, initially the public protector, which remained a thorn in the side, and critically also the SANDF, not that it's a corrupt free entity, but was not an active player in the Zuma agenda. And of course, they also managed to, they captured some of the media, SABC, and then set up ANN7 and so on. But much of the media remained independent and very critical of them. And so between about 2007 and 2009, the unity began to fall apart, and it increasingly did so. And then what happened in 2008 was that the global financial capitalist crisis impacted on South Africa and ended the commodity super cycle a couple of years later. So that huge, massive purchasing of coal and of iron ore and so forth, particularly by China, but also India and other places. This was what drove GDP growth during the era. It wasn't their macroeconomic policies. It was this massive commodity super cycle. And it crashed, not because of Zuma, okay, but because of global developments. And so this crash then deepened the already crisis levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and introduced more turmoil, unstable dominance, hegemony of attempted building of hegemony by the Zuma bloc. And then at least by 2016, if not earlier, there was an emergence of a broad anti-corruption front inside of the ANC, inside of the alliance, with the SACP increasingly now playing a very active role in that. COSATU unevenly, kind of revived 1996 class project networks, and a range of civil society formations, and big business formations as well, including BUSA. And we had that interesting development, I think it was 2016 or 17, when the party hosted an anti-corruption, anti-state capture conference, and it was attended enthusiastically by BUSA and so forth, all of which was important. And I say it's important because, you know, if we look at Brazil, where the imperialists and the right-wing, extreme right-wing, has used the corruption, anti-corruption struggle to install an extremely right-wing, rabid right-wing Bolsonaro. In Brazil, for instance, there the anti-corruption struggle had left the progressive left forces, trade unions, and so on, off balance. They weren't able to be effective, integrated into the anti-corruption fight. And we did not and have not allowed the anti-corruption struggle to be hegemonized by a neoliberal axis or even a right-wing axis. And that's been important. Okay, so did we get a new dawn? So this broad anti-corruption front was the basis on which Zuma was forced to step down, partly as a result, Comrade Deputy Speaker, that as a result of a shift in the ANC parliamentary caucus. Remember, in February 2018, when the ANC said to Zuma, unless you step down by Thursday, we will use our ANC caucus to lead a vote of no confidence in you. And because of the earlier vote of no confidence, in which some 35, 40, including many SACP MPs, had voted with the EFF and DA against what we were told to do, it was a credible threat by February 2018, and Zuma very reluctantly stepped down. And it was on this basis then that the CR17 platform won the tiniest of victories at the 2018 NASREC Conference. Now, what Comrade Ramaphosa has been trying to do initially, okay, was to align the three key forces within the ANC and broad ANC alliance. The left axis, which had by and large supported him against the state capture venture. The 1996 class project, I don't know if that's still a valid term, but you know what I mean by that. And even some Zumaites, the ones less implicated, tried to create space for them to reform, for them to understand, even if it was opportunistically, that if they carried in their ways, they would end up in jail, or that the ANC would lose elections and so forth. But at the same time, applying the slow poison of a revamped criminal justice system, the Zonda Commission, the Party Commission, and so forth. But you know, this unity, and unity was the kind of language that Ramaphosa, perhaps understandably, spoke a great deal about inside of the ANC, was of course going to be and was always a thoroughly unstable reality. And part of it was because there were agendas that work. And for us, the party, and what I'm describing as the left axis, the narrow CR17 victory at NASREC and then his election as president was an opportunity to embark on a serious, very belatedly now, second radical phase of the National Democratic Revolution. For the 1996 class project Access and for Monopoly Capital, the CR17 victory was an opportunity to return to what they regarded as the good policies, neoliberal policies of 1996. And for the Zumaites, the prospect was to hold their ground as best as possible. The fact that they were equally balanced, if not even better, in the NWC, in the NEC, in the top 6 and 7, to continue to erode the CR platform victory, to sustain primitive accumulation under the false flag of RET, to stay out of jail, and to reverse the outcomes through paralyzing the ANC's ability and government's ability to deal with corruption, and obviously to proceed eventually to an elective NGC. Next slide. Okay, so in this background, increasingly what we've seen, against this background, increasingly what we've seen is that there's been a growing chorus from the media, from big business, from COSATU CC, for Ramaphosa to act more decisively. Okay, growing sense of despair and concern that he was too much of a consensus builder, failure to act more decisively, and so on. Okay. And I think there's understandable reasons for thinking that. And I think many of us, including myself, also felt impatient at the slowness of it. But it's important to remember that the act more decisively often meant two things and not just one thing. And this was particularly the case with the corporate-friendly media commentators, big capital, and others. So act more decisively meant act against corruption, and yes, we agree, but also act more decisively to support Mboweni Treasury's austerity plans, come out more clearly in favor. Why didn't Ramaphosa sign the letter to the IMF rather than allowing it to be Tito Mboweni, the Minister of Finance? You know, put your colors to the mast. And act more decisively against COSATU and the public sector unions who are preventing you from moving. So an equation between the failure to move effectively on corruption with the failure or weakness to act effectively against COSATU, public sector unions, and to implement and back openly and decisively austerity policies. Let's move along. So what is to be done? Okay, and I'm approaching an end, and I realize I've gone on much longer than I'm intended, as always, as Eunice will say. So it's important that the party and progressive comrades keep up the pressure on the collective ANC leadership to take against corruption. The things that we are not, that Ramaphosa, for instance, talked about in his letter to ANC members. Let's have serious lifestyle audits, annual declarations of interests, strengthening of the integrity committee, suspension of those charged, not where charges have been laid by Black First, Land First, but who those are charged,
clarity on the stance of family members doing business with government. But at the same time, as we keep this pressure on, be careful that we don't imagine that Ramaphosa has a free hand inside of the ANC. Needs to be decisive. And I think there are signs that there's some degree of this. The key point that I've made earlier and want to repeat is that the key leverage in dealing with corruption is greatly strengthening and deepening the capacity of the criminal justice system. Strengthening and resourcing NPA, SIU, Hawks, FICs, SARS, etc., etc., etc. And this welcome consolidation of interagency collaboration, including the Zondo Commission regulation, which now allows the NPA to interact with the Zondo Commission. But we must be very careful in this. And so I was a little concerned when, for instance, Casati, in a wonderful CEC statement, said, you know, Ramaphosa, we hold Ramaphosa personally responsible for the corruption. He must now wield a big axe. Yes, hopefully within the ANC. But what Ramaphosa mustn't do is interfere politically with the criminal justice system. He must support it. I mean, government must support it, resource it effectively. But that is exactly what the Zumaites are hoping will happen, that there will be a politicization and factionalizing of the criminal justice system, which is exactly how they managed to get out of the state corruption. Zuma managed to dodge for a while the arms deal corruption charges. Okay, now coming to the point. In the midst of this, this is the second main point, the COVID-19 pandemic and the global economic meltdown, Treasury and the Reserve Bank continue to present public debt in South Africa, and not unemployment, not poverty, not inequality, as the crisis. And they even moralize public debt as if sovereign debt were the result of some naughty behavior. Now, obviously, some of that public debt is the result of corruption. It's not the same, it's not equivalent to it. The public debt is, you know, and all governments have public debt, basically. I mean, the DG in Treasury, even in his court papers challenging the public sector unions, said it would be immoral to pay public sector workers their 2019-20 wage increases on which government had previously agreed. If Esmagashule is undermining Ramaphosa's attempts to deal with corruption, has tried to do that, then Treasury, frankly, is using its dominance over budget and its ideological convergence with the Reserve Bank to undermine government and Ramaphosa's announced stimulus package. Austerity is presented as if it were the cutting edge against corruption. Next slide. So here, you probably can't read it, but this is an IMF graph. And it's basically looking at the G20 economies and what's been announced by way of stimulus packages in terms of percentage of GDP. And on the right is Germany and UK and France and so on. And the extreme left is South Africa, where our announced stimulus package is the lowest by far of all, in terms of GDP announcement, of all G20 economies. And what's worse is that we know that that stimulus package is not really a stimulus package. Most of it is just reoriented existing budget things. So it's not a budget thing. So it's shocking. It's hugely problematic. Next slide. Which is why I've tried to title this thing, The Struggle is on Two Fronts, and why they are linked. We have to consolidate the state-led offensive and movement-led offensive against corruption. But we must widen it to include capital flight, tax base erosion, abusive tax havens, areas in which Treasury, frankly, SARS and others have been extremely weak. So I'm not saying that Treasury is corrupt. I don't think it is, or that SARS is that the Reserve Bank is corrupt. They are allies in the struggle against corruption, in the one sense, in the technical sense, but they are not pursuing this massive erosion, basic theft of South African surplus. Okay. But we also have to defeat the crippling austerity program that they are trying to entrench. Okay. we have to build a productive state, a state with capacity. We have to address the real issues facing the working class and the poor, the triple crisis and so on, which are creating fertile grounds for demagogic populism, for xenophobia, for the JZ Fight Back campaign, for the EFF, and for a bogus form of radical economic transformation. The immediate struggles, against austerity must be for the public sector pay, for a basic income grant, for UIF to be hugely expanded and improved, for national health insurance, for public employment programs, for a major social and economic infrastructure build. And none of those things are going to be driven effectively with the current austerity package and bogus stimulus package that Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank are dishing up on us. Which is, to put it another way, we must avoid another stagism. We mustn't imagine that first we will deal with corruption and the left and Treasury and all of us must work together on that. We must work together in the struggle against corruption, but we must first do that. And then in a second moment, we can deal with stimulating the economy, developing a developmental state. Without major stimulus, corruption won't be defeated, but at the same time, without rolling back corruption at the same time, the stimulus package will just be consumed by state capture, by the next generation of Guptas and so on. So these are not two separate struggles. That's why they're linked. They are absolutely linked to critical struggles. And therefore, I hope that COSATU, for instance, on October the 7th, when it launches its general strike, is a strike against corruption, but is also a strike against neoliberal programs, miserable neoliberal programs against austerity. We must link the two struggles, not delink them. Thanks very much, and apologies for going on for so long. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. We've got less than half an hour, Jenny. Do you want to quickly, in 2 minutes, just give us an overview of